Greetings and salutations to all of my cutie patooties out there. This is going to be the Christmas special, the Christmas collaboration for 2024. This will be my 2021, 22, 23, 24, so my fourth Christmas episode / whatever, fourth Christmas as a narrator. And I figured why not bring along some friends that I've met along the way that narrate, have their own channels, do their own thing, and make this a big, thick ass episode for you to listen to for the Christmas season. Just wanted to let you guys know that this is a collaboration. There's multiple narrators. There's multiple narrators on here, and I hope you have a very Merry Christmas, a happy holiday wherever you are in the world, whether you celebrate the holiday or not, whether you like Christmas or not, whether you're a Scrooge or not, whether you're a Buddy the Elf or not. Merry Christmas, everybody. Thank you for listening and supporting for 3 years now, and I look forward to many, many more. Ciao. I remember that December with a chill that settles in my bones. Every year, every holiday, I still think about it. We always had snow in the suburbs. It would blanket the lawns and weigh down the trees around us. But it wasn't just the snow that stuck around longer than it should have. There was something else in the air that year, something that damn near ruined my whole Christmas. It had been one of those quiet Christmases. No guests, no house full of chaos and laughter. Just my wife Laura and our kids, Ryan, 12, and Tilda, 7. We had a good life back then. A warm house with a wood-burning fireplace. The smell of cookies always wafting from the kitchen. Laura was really just a wonder that way, somehow balancing the demands of work and motherhood with ease. She could wrangle a roast all the while decorating the tree. Her laughter still ringing out even when the kids were driving her up the wall. She's perfect and always has been. That particular Christmas though, we had a few rare days off and we planned to spend them at home. Usually either my brother or Laura's sister would visit us, filling up that house with the kind of noise you only get when too many cousins are packed into one living room. But not that year. Maybe it was the bad weather, or maybe we just needed a break from the holiday hustle. Whatever the reason, it was just us four, tucked away inside our little snow globe. The snow started to fall a week before, piling up in drifts that turned our quiet street into a postcard. At first, it had been really magical. Tilda insisted on building a snowman, even though the wind made her nose red and the snow was hard to work with. Brian helped begrudgingly, while I shoveled the driveway for the third time that week. Laura had watched from the window, waving now and again as she sipped at her coffee. By the time Christmas Eve rolled around, the magic had started to wear thin though. The temperatures had now plummeted into single digits. The snow was no longer fresh and fluffy. It had turned to crusted ice, treacherous and unyielding. We stayed indoors, huddled around the fireplace, playing board games and watching movies. Ryan grumbled occasionally about the Wi-Fi being spotty, and Tilda continued to try to sneak extra marshmallows into her hot cocoa. It was cozy in its own way, but there was this tension beneath it all. It's just the usual holiday stress, I told myself. But looking back now, I wondered if I sensed it even then, a shadow of what was to come. I chalked it up to the snow, or the way it muffled the world, but that night, as we sat around the table playing Monopoly and bickering over who got to be the dog, I felt it rise up again, an uneasy quiet, seeping in through the walls. I shook it off, focused instead on the warmth of the fire and the sound of Tilda giggling as she bankrupt her brother. Laura caught my eye and smiled, her cheeks flushed from the wine that she'd constantly been sipping at. For a moment, everything went back to normal, perfect even. But perfection has this way of shattering, especially when you least expect it. Night crept in earlier than usual. The winter sky swallowed up the last of the light just before dinner was even finished. By the time we were settling into a game of Clue, it was completely black outside. Laura lit a few candles, their glow softening the edges of the room. Ryan quickly set up the board on the coffee table, while Tilda debated between being Miss Scarlet or Mrs. Peacock. The fire was really the only real warmth in the room. We had central heat and air, but I really only tried to let it run so high. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its glow comforting, but fading with each passing minute. I hadn't thought about the firewood since this morning, but now those dwindling flames had caught my attention. I glanced at the pile next to the hearth. It was only down to a few logs. "Hey, I'm gonna go grab some more wood before it burns out completely," I said aloud. "Won't be long," Laura replied. She didn't look up from the game pieces that she was softly arranging, but her voice had this slight edge to it. The cold hit me the moment I stepped outside, biting at my skin and stealing my breath. It made me feel like I had to piss pretty much instantly. I paused for a moment on the porch, squinting out into the dark. The snow was reflecting just enough light to make out shapes, trees, and the faint outline of the shed. I pulled my coat tighter and clicked on my flashlight. The beam of light cut out through the dark and swept over the yard as I trudged towards that shed. The snow crunched loudly beneath me. As I neared the shed, something caught my eye. A line of footprints in the snow, faint but unmistakable. They cut across the yard, leading from the side of the house to the tree line beyond the shed. I stopped in my tracks, frowning. The snow had been undisturbed all day. No one that I know of has come or gone. Even the mailman. It was Christmas, for crying out loud. Those footprints looked fresh though. The edges were still crisp. My first thought was maybe a neighbor had cut through the yard, chasing their dog or a kid playing in the snow, but at this hour, why didn't I hear anybody? I scanned the area with my flashlight again, the beam jumping from shadow to shadow. The footprints were too small to be an adult's, but too spaced out to belong to Tilda or even Ryan. I felt a prickle of unease, a sense of just wrongness that I couldn't shake. Kids wander though. People cut through yards all the time. It's not that big of a deal. I reached the shed finally and pulled open the door, the hinges creaking in protest. The air inside was stale and cold, and I could smell the wood, damp and lingering in the darkness. I set my flashlight down on a shelf, angling it so the beam would light up the firewood. As I reached that first log, something on the floor caught my eye, a stain dark against that snow-dusted wood. Blood. The stain was small, almost easy to miss, but it looked super fresh. I crouched down, peering closer. A thin trail of droplets led out of the shed, disappearing into the snow beyond. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the trail, my breath foggy in front of me as I moved ahead. The trail of blood led around the side of the shed and toward the trees. Each step I took felt heavier than the last. And then, just as I rounded the corner, I saw a figure, hunched and shuffling through the snow. His silhouette was barely even visible, even in the faint light of my flashlight. He wore this bulky coat, hood pulled up. His movements were slow and labored. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to process what I was really looking at. The trail led straight to him, thickening with each step. "Hey!" I called out to him. "Are you okay? Do you need any help?" I didn't get a response. He just kept moving. I took a step closer, shining the flashlight on him even more now. The beam caught the edge of his coat. There was a lot more blood, so much of it. "Hey!" I called out again, louder this time. "Stop, you're hurt!" The man then paused, and slowly he turned around. The movement was stiff and unnatural though. It made me think he was an older guy. His face was still hidden in shadow, the hood of his coat blocking out any features. I raised the flashlight and the beam illuminated his face. His skin was super pale, almost translucent. His eyes were sunken in. Blood was streaked across his face, smeared across his mouth and his chin. His lips looked cracked and raw. He just stared at me, unblinking. His breath was visible in the icy air. Then he moved. He lunged forward, his movements jerky and fast. I stumbled back, my boots slipping on the snow, flashlight tumbling from my hand. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet. He was heading straight for me, his arms outstretched, his bloody fingers grasping at the air. Holy shit, this can't be real. I ran, but my breath was coming in short, my legs burning with the effort. There's no denying it, I was drunk. The shed was my only refuge, the only place I could think to go. I reached it just as his footsteps closed in behind me. The sound of snow crunching beneath his feet deafening inside that quiet. I dove inside, slamming the door shut and fumbling with the latch. My hands were shaking, my fingers were numb from the cold, but I managed to jam a screwdriver inside the lock. The door rattled violently as he slammed into it, the force of his impact shaking the thin wooden walls. I pressed my back against the door, chest heaving, mind racing. That screwdriver would only hold under a little pressure. It was through this tiny little loop latch. If you pulled too hard, it'd snap like dry spaghetti. And then as suddenly as it all started, the pounding stopped. The silence returned. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, footsteps, breathing, movement, but there was nothing, just the sound of my own heartbeat. I waited. Finally, I dared to peek through that small gap in the door. The figure was gone, his footsteps leading away from the shed, back towards those trees. I stayed in the shed longer than I should have, every nerve in my body wound tight, waiting for the sound of crunching snow to return back to me. It didn't, though. The world outside me was a frozen void, the silence more suffocating than any noise that could have been. Finally, I forced myself to get up, grab an armful of wood that I'd come for in the first place. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped all of the logs, but I managed to keep hold of them as I unlatched the door. My flashlight was gone, somewhere in the snow where I dropped it. I wasn't about to go looking for it either. I kept my eyes on the house, the golden glow of the windows cutting out through the darkness. One foot in front of the other, I told myself. Just get back to the house, the warmth, the light, the safety of your family. That man, he could have been anywhere. Every step I made me feel more exposed. I felt like I had a target on my back now. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop until I reached my porch. I threw the door open and stumbled inside, logs tumbling away from my arms and onto the floor. Laura and the kids looked up, startled by the commotion. "What happened?" Laura asked, her voice sharp with concern. There's somebody out there," I said, leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath. "He's in the woods, he's hurt or sick, I don't know." Her brow furrowed and she crossed the room over to me, placing a hand on my arm. "Slow down, what are you talking about?" Brian and Tilda were watching us now, their eyes wide. I realized how I must look, pale and shaking, snow clinging to my coat and boots. I forced myself to take a deep breath, to keep my composure. "There's a man outside. He's bleeding. He came right up to the shed and then tried to get in." Laura's face paled, but she kept her composure as well. "Did you call the police?" I shook my head. No, I don't even have my phone, and he ran off back into the woods." Even as I said that, the words felt hollow. Ran off. It sounded so mundane, so harmless, compared to the terror that had gripped me just moments ago. "Dad?" Ryan's voice was small and hesitant. "Are we okay?" I looked at him and then at Tilda, who was clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest. I wanted to reassure them, to tell them yes, that everything was fine, that we're safe. But I couldn't find the words. "I'm gonna go check the neighbor's house," I said instead, brushing past Laura into the kitchen. "Wait, you're going back out there?" she asked, panic creeping up into her voice. I grabbed my phone from the counter and turned back to her. "Just to make sure they're okay, just stay here and lock the doors." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue with me. She just ushered the kids into the living room. I stepped back out into the cold, my phone in my hand, and made my way to the nearest house. I slowly approached our neighbor's house, Greg. His lights were on, the soft glow was spilling out into the porch. I knocked hard on the door. A moment later, Greg's familiar face came peering out, half concerned and half annoyed. "What's going on?" he said, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. I know this is a weird question, but did you happen to see anybody else out here tonight?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. He frowned at me. No. What makes you ask that?" "There's this man," I said, glancing over my shoulder at the woods. "He was hurt and bleeding and, well, he came through my yard." Greg shook his head. No, I haven't seen anything like that. You sure it wasn't just some kind of drunk guy, maybe?" I hesitated. Is that what I saw? The rational part of my brain wanted to latch on to Greg's explanation. A drunk guy stumbling through the snow, bleeding from God knows what, something mundane, super explainable. But the image of that face, pale and bloody, just lingered in my mind and refused to fade. "Maybe," I said finally. "Just keep an eye out, okay?" "Will do," Greg said, though he didn't look too convinced. I checked with the other neighbors, and none of them had seen or heard anything as well. By the time I got back home, the fear had kind of dulled into this uneasy exhaustion. Laura had locked all the doors and the kids were curled up on the couch, fast asleep. "I didn't see him again," I told her quietly as I pulled off my boots. She just nodded. "Should we call the police now?" "And tell them what?" I said. "That some guy wandered through the yard? And just write it off as a vagrant or maybe a drunk. Unless he comes back, there's not really anything they can do." I could tell she didn't like it, but she didn't argue. We banked the fire and went back to the board game. The next morning, that snow had covered the blood trail, erasing any evidence of what had happened. I just shoveled the driveway as I listened to the distant laughter of the kids playing in the side yard. Maybe it was just a drunk guy wandering through our yard on a cold winter night, but who knows? Merry Christmas, I guess.
It was supposed to be a joyful day, just 3 days before Christmas with the streets buzzing with last-minute shoppers, and I'd finished work early and had decided to head down into town to grab a coffee and watch the skaters on the ice rink in George Square before heading home. The square is the absolute heart of Glasgow during the Christmas period and is alive with families and couples and groups of friends, all bundled up against the cold. And the air smelled of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine from nearby stalls, and as I walked, I was reminded of just how special that time of year can be. I turned onto Queen Street, walking in the direction of George Square as I kind of soaked up the festive atmosphere, and then it happened. Looking back on it, I think I noticed the bin lorry before most did. It seemed out of place, and something about the way it lumbered along just didn't seem right to me. It was veering ever so slightly and wasn't following the usual stop-start rhythm of city center traffic. At first, I thought maybe the driver was in a rush somewhere, or perhaps a wee bit over-eager to finish the day's work before his Christmas break. But then, it swerved. The lorry crossed over the curb, mounting the pavement, and that's when it all kicked off. The massive green monstrosity of a truck careened towards the crowds on Queen Street, leaving people with no time at all to react. Some froze in shock, others tried to run, pulling their kids along with them as they did, but the truck was moving too fast and moved too unpredictably, and they didn't stand a chance. I remember hearing a woman scream, my eyes darting toward her for a split second before they locked back on the lorry. I then gasped in horror as it smashed into street furniture, first a bench, then a row of bins, and it just kept going, completely unstoppable. The glass shattered as it clipped a shop window, and the sound of metal screeching against metal was near deafening. Panic spread like wildfire, and people shouted warnings, trying in vain to get innocent bystanders out of the way in time. At one point, I saw a young lad grab an elderly woman off the pavement just in time, and the lorry must have missed them by inches. Others weren't so fortunate. I then watched the lorry plow through a group of people, and I'll never forget the way their bodies bumped into each other, knocking each other over like bowling pins. Some people were hit so hard it took them right out of their shoes, and people kept screaming for the driver to stop, but it was like he couldn't hear us. The truck barreled through Queen Street, turning into George Square. My feet carried me forward, instinctively following, and I felt powerless, and I just needed to know what was happening. When I reached the square, the scene was like something from a nightmare. It was supposed to be a place of joy, with fairy lights and the giant Christmas trees standing in the center, and instead it was a scene of pure horror. After hitting a building, the lorry had finally stopped, but the damage had already been done. I saw a pram overturned near the Christmas market stalls, and a man knelt beside it as he checked on the child inside, and the baby was crying, and I remember feeling the small twinge of relief as I realized that it was still alive. People lay motionless on the ground, bystanders kneeling next to them to give them CPR. Others shouted desperately into their phones for ambulances to come quicker. And I stood there, rooted to the spot, barely able to process what I was seeing. And then a man next to me said, "Bloody hell, that's like a war zone." And that's all I could do was agree. And there was this horrible mix of groans, screams, and sirens wailing in the distance. And I later learned that the driver had suffered some kind of medical emergency, a heart attack, or a blackout or something like that, and lost control of the lorry. At the time, though, no one knew, and the not knowing made it all the worse. I found myself looking at a woman who sat on the ground cradling another in her arms, and the woman in her lap wasn't moving. Her face was pale, her lips slightly parted as though she were about to speak, and the first woman, maybe her friend, sister, or stranger, rocked back and forth whispering, "It's gonna be okay." But I could tell that she feared the worst. Police arrived quickly, cordoning off the area and ushering the uninjured away, and they looked as shaken as we were, and so did the paramedics as they flooded the square and started loading people onto stretchers. It felt wrong to leave, but I wasn't helping by staying, so I moved to the edge of the square and stood beneath the massive Christmas tree until I was finally able to just leave. And in the days that followed, details trickled out slowly on the news. 6 people dead, and a lot were left with life-changing injuries. Glasgow was stunned, and tributes poured in for those that had lost their lives. Flowers and messages filling George Square, and a vigil gathered to pay their respects. The crowd was made up of survivors, bystanders, and well-wishers, all sharing their stories, all trying to make sense of what was impossible to make sense of. And for weeks afterwards, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. I kept thinking about the young couple that I'd seen earlier, laughing together as they walked hand in hand down Queen Street. Were they okay? Had they made it out unscathed? And what about the woman with the pram? And I still find myself asking those questions sometimes. Even now, years later, I still make an effort to avoid George Square around Christmas time if possible. The city came together in the aftermath, as Glasgow always does, with a spirit of resilience and community. But the scars remain, and for those of us who were there, the 22nd of December will never be just another day.
Okay, I know this sounds really bah humbug for me to say, but I'm ready for this holiday season to end. The only thing I've gotten for Christmas so far is a creepy stalker, so I'm pretty much done. Every year I pick up a little extra money by operating the camera for Santa at the mall. It's extremely easy. The camera sits on a tripod, the kid sits on Santa, and I click the button. The end. Most customers don't even notice me, but this year, one man in particular noticed me way too much. Once Barb takes the customer's money, she sends the kid up to sit on Santa's lap while the parents usually circle like vultures to snap a picture from every angle. Some of them stand a little too close for comfort, but it's usually because I'm invisible, not because they're being creeps. Over the years, I've learned to ignore them right back. Well, a couple of days ago, a little girl was with Santa, and her father stood next to me as he took his pictures. I noticed him after taking my own, and we exchanged the customary polite smiles. But then he didn't move along. Instead, he introduced himself and wished me a Merry Christmas, which I cheerfully returned, only to have him launch into a story about the little girl being his niece. He kept stressing the word as if it were really important that I didn't think she was his daughter. I continued smiling politely, but then Rick went on to explain that he had to bring her to see Santa because his brother was in the hospital with cancer, and the girl's mother had died in childbirth. If that's true, my heart bleeds for the poor girl. But, in my experience, when someone begins blabbing their life story to a stranger in such detail, it's either because they are so overwhelmed that it spills out of them involuntarily, or because they want a pat on the back while you fawn over what a great person they are. Or, of course, it's all a complete lie, because some disgusting man wants to get in your pants. This genuinely felt like the latter. I'm 29, and this guy is pushing at least 50. He also reeked of cigarettes and looked like he hadn't showered in a couple weeks. The little girl, bless her little heart, didn't appear as if she was being cared for properly at all. Her face and clothes were dirty, her hair wasn't brushed, and my chest ached for her. I hated to see Barb give Santa the 30-second warning, but her uncle was creeping me the hell out, and if we let every kid talk as long as they wanted, we would never get to them all. He saw the signal too, and asked if I would have dinner with him after my shift. Not wanting to be overly rude, I simply said that my boyfriend and I already had plans, but that wasn't good enough. An angry look flashed across his face that let me know that he was definitely unstable and not just an awkward man with poor hygiene. He actually argued that I couldn't know who I would like more if I didn't give him a chance. I didn't even try to hide my look of disgust, but he was so lost in his fantasy world he didn't even notice. Thankfully, the mall security guard did. I hadn't even realized it, but I'd been moving backwards as Rick came closer to the point that he was now in front of my camera, and I was out in the customer's area. The little girl was finished with Santa and watching us from the exit aisle, and the next kid was waiting for me to take a picture. Once Mike got rid of the weirdo, I explained what happened to Barb, and while I was doing that, Mike came back to share his own concerns. Once they were out of earshot, Rick had told him that I was his girlfriend, and that he was trying to see what time my shift ended. When Mike pretended not to know when I got off, the guy got belligerently angry and demanded that he find out. When I got off an hour later, a different security guard walked me to my car just to be safe, but we didn't see the guy. The next morning, Barb said that Rick had returned 10 minutes before closing and seemed to be looking for me, but left when I wasn't there. I was already freaking out, but then Rick showed up again around lunchtime. He said his niece hadn't been able to finish her wish list yet. To avoid a scene, and because all of our hearts broke for that poor kid, we let them stand in line. But I, quote-unquote, went on break the moment he was close enough to try to speak to me. Mike made it a point to take the pictures for me when I went to the employee break room, and Rick watched me like a hawk through the entire exchange. When it was his turn to go next and I still hadn't come back, he let the person behind him skip the line. Well, Mike, being the awesome guy that he is, wasn't going to play that shit. He very politely explained that I absolutely would not be returning while he was there, and that if he let one more person skip the line, they would be asked to leave and banned from returning. Rick tried the girlfriend story again, but Mike called him out on that too. Then the crazy bastard tried to say that we were just going through a rough patch, but he was here to apologize, and if I only knew that, I would want to talk to him. Rick turned red as a tomato and physically shook with anger as he pulled his niece out of line. She began crying and begging to see Santa one more time, but he kept going without so much as a glance down. I'm glad I didn't have to see it, but I wish so badly that that child didn't have to suffer because of her uncle, or whoever he is to her. Mike got off before my shift ended, but made sure the other security guards knew Rick's face and kept an eye on me. I worked till closing that night. So far, my new stalker hadn't returned, and we hoped that he had been embarrassed enough to just move on. But one of the guards still walked me to my car just to be safe. Jerry is a 45-year-old father of 3 who's been working security jobs for over 15 years, and he saved my life that night. We didn't see anyone, even though we were both looking hard. Everything was still and quiet. My car sat by itself. The closest vehicle to it was 3 spots away, closer to the mall, and nothing on the far end at all. But when we passed that vehicle, Rick leapt from behind it and stabbed Jerry in his side. I've never seen someone move so fast. Jerry grabbed Rick's wrist as he tried to stab him a second time, and there was a sickening snap as he broke the bone and the knife clattered to the ground. Everything happened so fast it was like a blur. Both men were screaming, but Jerry got the psycho on the ground and called for help over his radio. Everyone came running out, and 3 other guys piled on top of Rick while a 4th called 911. This is America, and we aren't filthy rich, so Jerry begged me not to call an ambulance, which I fully understood. I drove him to the hospital myself, and thankfully he's going to make a full recovery. I'd never be able to live with myself if that sweet man died trying to save me. Needless to say, he's getting a fat Christmas ham as soon as I can get the nerve to leave my house again. Rick was obviously arrested, but we're still waiting to see exactly what that process will be. I'm trying really hard not to let this actually ruin my Christmas, but it's not easy. I told my boss that I couldn't work any more shifts this year, and she was very supportive. I don't know if I'll be able to do it next year or not. I guess time will tell. But anyway, thanks for listening. I hope you all have a Merry Christmas.
And just like that, he was standing there, alive. OP gives a summary in the form of a TLDR, but I don't think that's what you and I are here for. Let's read the whole thing. Here's a little background. My mom grew up in a small town and is still extremely close with many of her childhood friends, one of whose name is Liz. Changed her name for anonymity's sake. My family lives in the capital city, and the town that she grew up in is about a 4 to 5 hour drive away. But my parents visit there multiple times a year, so keeping contact is easy. Liz was married to a man named John. Again, name changed for anonymity's sake. John was a big, tall man and one of my favorite uncles growing up. At some point, they moved from the small town about 40 minutes away into the countryside and set up their farm and had a child. About 5 to 6 years ago, John very suddenly passed away, leaving Liz and everybody else devastated. John died one cold December morning when he was home alone doing his morning farm tasks and tending to the Christmas decorations and lights that had been put up, when he had a stroke whilst outside in the freezing, snowy cold. This was very early in the morning, and neither his wife nor daughter would be home for another 6 to 8 hours. So he laid there, outside, unconscious, until his wife finally returned home to find him dead. This next part, I remember very, very well. I was at home and was helping my mom make dinner when Liz called to tell her of her husband's passing, and when my mom hung up the phone, she burst into tears and broke the news to me and the rest of the family. We all took it pretty hard. I was 19 or maybe 20 years old at the time and didn't live at home, so admittedly the next few days were a bit of a blur as I was not home constantly. I didn't attend the funeral myself, and I'm not sure exactly why, but I will say, in itself, that is not strange for my family and how we usually do things. I mean, my siblings and I didn't even go to my real uncle's funeral last year. That, and it probably being a few-day affair, I wouldn't have been able to get enough time off of work to do so. I vaguely remember my parents making the trip, and for some reason, I remember my mom stressing over what she would wear to the funeral. Over the following years, I remember his death being brought up quite a few times, and Liz, either alone or with her daughter, coming to the capital to visit us and other friends. She usually stayed in our guest bedroom. Every time that I thought about John and his death and how devastated she and they must still be, as his death was 100% a matter of fact. Well, cut to last summer. I was living at home for a couple of months when my mom texts me, "Liz is on her way to town and they'll be staying with us. I won't be home for a couple of hours. Can you please prep the guest bedroom just in case I don't make it in time?" To which I responded, "Yeah, of course." And I proceeded to make the bed, and I assumed it was her and her daughter. I also put the extra mattress for her on the other side of the room, as we usually did. One single duvet for the bed, and one single duvet for the mattress, and 2 sets of guest towels on the dresser. Again, this is what we usually did for them when they came to stay. My mom comes home, and I go off to the store to get some things for the barbecue that my mother decided we were going to have. When I pull up our driveway, I see her car, so I walk through the door and I call out, "Liz, Tina." As I lay the bags down to take my shoes off, I hear, "Oh wow, apparently I don't deserve a hello," said in a joking voice. A voice familiar, but I still had no idea who it was, so I walked a little further in to see a man standing with his arms open for embrace in the kitchen. Tina rushed to hug me, and Liz was in the bathroom. I'm standing there very confused by this man and who he was, when it kind of hit me. That's John. Followed immediately by, no, of course, that's not John. This must be some relative or something that's come for a visit. So I hugged him and said something like, "Oh, of course you do. I just thought you would prefer the hug." And I hugged this familiar stranger, planning to sneakily ask my mom to remind me who he was. Liz came out of the bathroom, gave me a hug, and walked right past the man and sat down next to my mom at the kitchen table. I motioned for my mom to help me with the alcohol that I had left in the car, when outside I whispered to her, "Who's that man in the kitchen again?" To which she looked at me like I was a crazy person and said, "What do you mean? That's John. He just lost a little bit of weight." And I realized that my initial thought was correct, and that was in fact a slightly skinnier John. I was at a loss for words, and my mom just stared at me in my surely pale, look like I've just seen a ghost face, and asked if everything was all right, and all I could say was, "Mom, John is dead." She laughed and asked, "What the hell are you talking about? Of course he's not dead. What do you mean?" I explained everything and how I swear that we have talked about his death multiple times since it happened, how it happened, and the phone call from Liz when we were making dinner, and even that she had said they in the text. I assumed it was just Liz and Tina, and therefore made the guest bedroom ready for 2 people instead of 3. My mom looked extremely confused, but told me what really happened. He did have a stroke, and he was lying unconscious outside, and neither Liz nor Tina would have been home for hours if Liz had not forgot something at the house and they had to drive back to get it, arriving just minutes after John had fallen unconscious. She was able to call the emergency services and get John into the car. Remember, he was a big man and must have taken incredible strength, and drive towards the ambulance. This ultimately saved John's life. He wouldn't have survived if she had not forgotten her wallet and had to drive back. He has apparently come over many times with Liz and Tina and stayed at our house multiple times over the last few years. Me and my mom brushed this off as a huge misunderstanding, which maybe it probably is, but I still feel weird with the whole situation, as the fact that he died and the sorrow following his death still feels so real and true. What do you guys think? A glitch? An alternate reality? Me being crazy? Or just a misunderstanding?
This happened Christmas 2012 when I was 11 years old. My family has this tradition of having Christmas dinner at my grandparents' house. It's a beautiful old home out in the countryside, and they go all out and decorate it with heaps of wreaths and lights and a big, fully decorated Christmas tree in the living room. But despite how nice it was and how cheerful everyone seemed, I had never spent a night there. My parents always bundled us into the car late at night for the drive back home into the city. They never said why, they just insisted. But this year the snow was heavy from morning. It was nothing my dad's four-wheel drive couldn't handle though, and we thought we'd be fine. That was until evening, and a sudden snowstorm hit. It was so bad that all you could see in front of you was white. We tried to wait it out, but after an hour or so, we saw that leaving would be impossible that night. It's just one night, my mum assured my dad as we settled in for the evening. I couldn't help but notice the look of anxiety on my dad's face. It was a look I had never seen on him before. I was kind of excited and intrigued to spend the night at their house. Growing up, I never had and always wanted to. But honestly, as night crept in and my family retired to their rooms, a feeling of unease settled in my stomach. My grandparents' house, while beautiful, seemed different at night. Shadows stretched along, and the wind outside howled. My room for the night was the guest bedroom at the end of the hall, a room no one seemed to use or talk about. It was quaint but old, filled with antique furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I shrugged off the discomfort and tried to sleep. Sleep, however, was reluctant to come, as I lay huddled under a mountain of quilts and duvets. I just could never feel warm enough to drift off to sleep. Then, I heard it. A soft creaking. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old houses do that, right? As I lay there trying to sleep, I began listening to the wind outside, thinking that it might help soothe me. The more I listened, though, the more it seemed to be in the room with me as I lay there. Was a window open? That would explain the cold, I thought to myself. But the longer I listened, the more I came to the realization that it was whispering, faint unintelligible, as if coming from the walls themselves. I sat up, straining to catch any familiar words, but try as I might, I just couldn't make any out. The room felt even colder now, so cold I could clearly see my breath, and I could feel it in my bones. My heart began to pound, and I had a weird tingle go up the back of my neck to my scalp. It was not whispering I was hearing now. It was ragged breathing. I was not alone. Gathering what courage I could muster, I switched on the lamp beside me. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the air felt charged and kind of thick, if that makes sense. Like there was a presence I couldn't see. That's when I noticed the shadow in the corner, darker than the rest of the room. It didn't move, but it felt aware of me. I tried to rationalize, a trick of the light maybe. But then the whispering came back and grew more distinct, rising and falling, simultaneously in the corner of the room and right next to my ear. I couldn't take it anymore. Panic kicked in and I bolted from the bed, rushing to the door. It opened with such ease, I wondered if it had ever been closed. As I burst into the hallway, I could hear the whispers behind me. And now, a soft laugh, a childlike giggle. The house felt like it was holding its breath as I stumbled into the living room, where the soft glow of Christmas lights seemed a stark contrast to the darkness I left in that guest room. My parents found me curled on the couch the next morning, groggy and tangled in strands of blinking lights. I tried to explain what happened, expecting laughter or dismissal, but my grandfather just listened, his expression thoughtful.
That room,
He started, but trailed off, lost in his own thoughts. Finally, he simply said,
it holds many memories, especially at this time of year.
To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that room. My grandfather didn't say any more on the matter either. There was a sadness in his eyes, and my dad shushed me when I tried to press him. I still don't have an answer, but Christmas will never be the same for me. My grandfather has passed on now, so any chance of getting any information from him has gone. Perhaps one day I'll be able to get something from my father, but who knows? He didn't seem keen to talk about it back then.
This happened over 20 years ago. I was driving back home with my girlfriend at the time. It was Christmas Eve, and my mother's family used to hold a large celebration at my aunt's house in Estacada. This was my girlfriend's first time meeting my extended family, but she got on quite well with them. We spent the majority of the afternoon and evening talking, playing poker, opening presents, and drinking an assortment of adult beverages. My girlfriend had been quite inebriated by the time we had to leave. Therefore, I'd be driving us home. It was around 11 p.m. or so. I was driving my girlfriend's car along Highway 211. Now, this stretch of road is surrounded by farms and dense patches of forest, and parts of it are unlit. But nothing to fear. I grew up in this area, so I knew this road like the back of my hand. The both of us were just driving and talking away, just two young lovers making the most of our moment together. There's a portion of the highway that descends down an enormous hill before crossing Deep Creek. Surrounding both sides of the road are thick forests. There are no lights. The only thing we could see was the area directly in front of our headlights. I drive down the hill, cross the bridge, and uphill through more forest. It's as the highway starts to flatten out that it happens. Something sprints across the road so suddenly that I almost hit whatever it was. I slam on the brakes. I turn to my girlfriend and ask her if she saw it. She confirmed that she had, but she couldn't make out what it was. Maybe it was a coyote, as they're fairly common sight in the area, but something felt off about it. Whatever it was that ran in front of the car disappeared into the woods next to the road. Coyotes don't usually dart out in front of cars. Not like that anyway. So for some reason I decide to check it out. I turn the car around and switch on the high beams to better light up the forest in which this thing had vanished in. I step out of the car and walk towards the woods. I don't see anything, but now it feels like perhaps I'd made a grave error. My heart is pounding and the hairs on the back of my neck are standing at full attention, but I still don't see anything unusual in the trees. Suddenly the car's horn blasts. It's not a beep 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 that you'd get as if you'd say your driver or passenger wanted to hurry up and get in the car. No, this was a long, blaring beep. I walked back into the car and asked my girlfriend why she leaned on the horn like that. She said nothing. Instead, she pointed to a spot about 50 feet from where I was standing. I looked over in that direction, and that's when I saw it. Surely this was the thing that ran out in front of our car. It was a man. He was completely naked. His skin was covered in dirt and mud, and in one of his hands he was holding a hatchet. He looked back at us, and then he smiled and waved to us just before turning around and walking back into the forest. Needless to say, we got the heck out of there. Once we were safely driving again, my girlfriend explained what had just happened. While I was trying to look for the man in the area he initially vanished in, he circled back around and came out from another spot in the forest, beyond my car headlights. My girlfriend had seen something out of the corner of her eye, and that's when she saw him. Before she honked the horn, he was walking towards me, his hatchet raised as if making to strike me. We called the authorities once we safely got back home, but they never found anybody. Or they did and just didn't tell us. But the officer we spoke to explained his theory. The man was obviously looking to ambush unsuspecting lone travelers for Lord only knows what reason. We all agreed that my girlfriend's quick thinking saved my life, as it let my potential killer know that I wasn't alone out there. I moved back into the area recently, so I now drive that highway often. No naked hatchet man sightings yet, but I can tell you that I'm definitely extra vigilant now, especially near Deep Creek.
This happened in my hometown, which is in the countryside. I have since moved away and I cannot say that I miss it if I'm being honest. Our family had this old-fashioned storehouse-like building next to our house. Naturally, our family used it for storage. We would put Christmas decorations in there, as well as the tree, offcuts of carpet, old cans of paint, and my bikes, stuff like that. One cold December morning, my dad asked me to go grab the box of Christmas decorations. It was in our back garden, so I went out of the kitchen door, the back door, down this slope that ran beside the garden, and then walked up to the storehouse. I had always found the storehouse a bit creepy, even during the day. There weren't any windows, so it didn't let any natural light in. There was something different about the storehouse that morning, though. Something that gave me a really bad feeling. I felt like I shouldn't be there, like my gut was telling me that there was something wrong, and I wasn't alone. I was pretty young, so I didn't really understand those feelings. I just knew that I had to come back with the decorations, or Dad wasn't going to be very happy with me. I was considering all this while I was stood by the door. I put the key in to unlock it, but when I turned it, I realized that it wasn't locked. It was probably me who used the storehouse last time, as that's where I was told to put my bike. So I thought, oh man, did I forget to lock it? If I did, I got away with it because my dad must not have noticed. I was a bit worried that my bike wouldn't be in there when I opened the door, but it was. I stood in the entrance looking in, using the natural light to try and locate the decorations. I saw the Christmas tree. I knew that I would probably be asked to get that next, so it caught my eye. Something looked off though. I looked just off to the side of the tree. It was partially covered by a black bin bag. Just off to the side of it was something pink. I stared at it a little longer. and it looked like skin. It looked to me like someone's hand. I was so confused, but I followed the line upwards, and then I got the shock of my life. I met eyes with someone. There was someone hiding in the storehouse. I saw his eyes in the dark, staring right at me. I should have listened to my gut. I should have never gone in there. That's hindsight for you, though. The guy in the storehouse just froze in place and stared at me. It was so scary, I also couldn't move. Then the stranger in the storehouse spoke. He said in a rough voice, "Hey kid, come here." I saw more of his face as he emerged from behind the tree. He looked incredibly dirty, and he had a graying beard, and that was about all I could take. I ran and I screamed for my dad. My dad came rushing downstairs, and I blubbered about what I had just seen, and he went charging out of the kitchen door down to the storehouse. When he got there, the creepy guy was already gone. He must have hopped the fence the second I started running off screaming. We did find some food wrappings, and he had arranged the bags of clothes in there to make a kind of makeshift bed. We don't know how long he had been in there, but it must have been more than a day or two. I got a big telling off for leaving the storehouse door unlocked. And we were a lot more security conscious after that day. To this day, I still get a bit freaked out when I have to go into dark places by myself, like attics, basements, and garages. It was a creepy Christmas memory for our family, but thankfully, one we can laugh about a little these days.
Dyer Street in El Paso has a history of violence, drugs, sex, and death. Ask anyone in El Paso about Dyer, and I guarantee they have a story about the Devil's Triangle, or the Econo Lodge. So it makes sense that the store I work at is most likely haunted. I work at Burlington, but it wasn't always a Burlington. It used to be a big Kmart till they closed it down in 2017 and opened up a strip mall there. All the people that have been there since it opened in 2022 have stories of stuff falling over and footsteps being heard. But I chalked it up to the building settling or something being off balance and falling. It wasn't until last week when I started to think otherwise. So I'm closing on Black Friday, which for Burlington isn't a big deal because we don't have any sales. I mean, come on, it's already a discount store. Regardless of that info though, the store was still packed to the gills with people doing their early Christmas shopping. It's a little past 8 p.m., and I'm helping a family take one of those little vehicles that kids can ride around to their truck. When I walk back in the store, I get a call on the radio that one of the closed-off fitting rooms has been opened. Now, that thing is locked up good, so I'm thinking some kids must have been yanking the doorknob or pushing down on it and broke it. When I go to check it out, the doorknob is fine and no one is inside. I lock it back up and go back to helping out up front. About 20 minutes later, I hear something fall behind me. I look back and see a Santa Claus lawn statue had fallen over. I didn't think anything of it when I picked it up. When I set it back in place, a stuffed snowman which was sitting on the top shelf fell in front of me and set off the touch lights we had on the jewelry. I stepped back to see if anyone had bumped into the shelves, but it was just me right there. I was a little freaked out at this point and took a couple steps away from that shelf. That's when the lights on the jewelry started flashing on. Now, these lights don't turn on unless you tap the boxes the jewelry is in. They blink a few times at random, then stop completely. Before I can process what I'm seeing, the doors behind me, which are automatic doors, start to open and close without anyone walking by them. They open and close 3 times before it all stops. No more blinking lights, doors are acting normally, and nothing is falling over anymore. I tell my supervisor about it when she walks by and she says, "Oh, must be the Kmart ghost again," and walked away with a light giggle. Nothing else happened the rest of the night, But every night I've worked since, something has fallen over without anyone around, and my other coworkers have said they've heard noises in the closed-off fitting rooms.
A few years ago, I did something terrible. Something that I deeply regret and wish that I hadn't done. Something that I can never take back. It all started with my girlfriend. Well, ex-girlfriend. Broke up with me. And I know this might seem trivial, just a part of life and growing as a person. However, for me, it had the complete opposite effect. I know that you'll probably think that I was childish, that I should have just taken it on the chin and moved on. And you'd be right. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was hurt. No, I was more than hurt. I was offended. Insulted. How could she? After everything that I have done for her. It was me who gave her a place to live, me who helped pay off her debts, me who helped her get a job, and she wanted to throw it all back in my face? I wasn't gonna let that go unpunished. I now know that I was petty, and that I was wrong. But you have to understand, I was desperate. I was hurting so badly. It honestly felt as though my heart was being ripped apart, throbbing so violently that I thought that it would explode and kill me right then and there. And I know that sounds dramatic. I'm not looking for sympathy. I don't deserve it. But I'm not the victim here. Not anymore. I made sure of that. And I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I wish that I could take it all back. I wish that I had just taken my own life instead. Maybe then none of this would have happened. But I was so broken and so furious I couldn't even sleep. My frustration boiled over. I was angry. So angry that I could feel my body shaking with rage. And I got up, filled with hatred and darkness, and booted up my laptop. I wasn't, and still am not, a stranger to the dark web. I had spent countless hours trying and often failing to navigate it, mostly out of boredom. I usually fell into the same old rabbit holes. Drug sites, honey traps, forums. Lots and lots of forums. I didn't really know what I was looking for or where to find it. But deep down, I think I knew. Subconsciously, I wanted her to hurt. I wanted her to feel the humiliation that I had felt. And my original plan, distasteful and wrong as it was, wasn't meant to be violent. I just wanted to humiliate her the way that she humiliated me. I still had photos and videos of her from our time together. You know, personal ones. And in my anger and despair, I thought that it would be just to use them against her. And I see now that I was wrong from the very beginning. But even so, I wished that I had stopped there. As awful as that would have been, it pales in comparison to what I actually did. I couldn't find what I was looking for right away. But I didn't give up. Of course I didn't. I kept digging, clicking link after link until I eventually stumbled upon something that caught my attention. A forum. It was called The Naughty List. The tagline read, "Do you know someone who's been bad? If so, maybe you should put them on the naughty list." Perfect, I thought. This had to be it. I'd upload all of the personal photos and videos of her, maybe even link her social medias. Then we'd see who was laughing. And for a fleeting moment, I even considered adding her address. But since she was living back with her family, even I drew the line there. Noble of me, right? God, how pathetic I was. And how pathetic I still am. The form wasn't what I expected. You couldn't just upload to their homepage. There were different sections or punishments, as they called them. And I remember thinking how dramatic it all was. How dumb and naive I had been. There were several different sections. Elf on a Shelf, Krampus, Cramps, Frozen Fields among them. Very Christmassy, right? I thought so. It even made me chuckle a bit. I guess that's why I didn't think that it was serious. A schoolboy mistake. And as we all know, mistakes always have consequences. Anyway, out of all the sections, Elf on a Shelf made me crack a half smile, but that wasn't the one that I chose. I picked something called Sleigh Snatcher. I don't know why. It just seemed funny to me. And after clicking on it, I had to wait a good minute and a half for a bright white page to load up, filled with a few black text boxes and some text that read, "Santa is waiting to write up his naughty list. Please fill in the details and he'll do the rest." Cute, I thought. It seemed so stupid, but still, I went ahead and I filled it out. Name, age, birthday, links to the person's social media, everything that I had been so desperately looking for was right here. And of course, photo uploads. Jackpot. I remember slimily smiling to myself, half cackling as I worked. It wouldn't allow me to upload videos, but the photos were more than enough. It also asked for the person's address, but as I mentioned earlier, I wasn't ready to go that far. Instead, I wrote in her hometown. Our hometown. Something that I deeply regret. I wish that I hadn't done any of it. But once I finished entering all of her information, I didn't hesitate. And I clicked submit. And after a few seconds, a small text box popped up asking, "Are you sure?" Santa won't forget. He checks the list twice. All names are final. And smugly I pressed yes. And that was that. Perfect, I thought, until I was redirected to another page. And it took a few minutes to load. But when it did, it caught me off guard. The page read, "Thank you for submitting to the naughty list. We really appreciate it. Sit back, relax, and Santa will sleigh snatch those ho-ho-hos. Santa will empty his sack and put them in one. He knows when you've been naughty." And the message made me pause. It took me a few minutes to process what it was saying, and then I laughed. As awful as that sounds, it's true. I mean, come on, it was disgusting and yeah, admittedly sick, but it was also kind of funny. And there was no way that it could be real, right? And there was no way that it could be real, right? But I didn't care. I had achieved my goal. And I thought, job done. It's all uploaded. People will see the photos, message her, and humiliate her. She would be the one pushed down into the dirt. And feeling better about myself, I calmly and confidently shut down and wiped my tracks, making sure that I couldn't be traced. I was already heavily protected, and I knew that. But anyone who's used the dark web will tell you, it's better to be safe than sorry. The next morning, I woke up with the biggest, most disturbing smile I've ever produced. I must have looked like the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. I was so damned pleased with myself. And looking back now, it makes me feel sick. But at the time, I couldn't wait to see the fruits of my labor. I wanted her to hurt. I wanted her to think that it was me, but have no way to prove it. I wanted to break her, to make her feel as worthless as she made me feel. But to my absolute dismay and disappointment, nothing happened. And I waited and waited, still nothing. No angry phone calls or texts, no outraged social media posts, nothing at all. And at first I thought that maybe she was trying to ignore it. Or maybe she had reported the abuse and had been told not to engage with any trolls or creeps. But surely it had worked, right? The truth is, there was no way for me to check. I couldn't find the link again even if I tried. Anyone who's surfed the deep web knows this. Nothing is cataloged. It's a chaotic mess. I had stumbled across the forum purely by chance. And oh, I wish I hadn't. A few more days went by and then my excitement had faded. I felt dejected and genuinely upset that it clearly hadn't worked. Nobody could stay so calm if it had. And I couldn't exactly go ask her or even go check. That would just point the finger straight at me. And so after a while, I gave up. Truthfully, the whole ordeal had become tiresome, and as sad as it sounds, it strangely made me feel better. Like I had gotten it all out of my system somehow. But then a few days later, I was awoken by a loud knock on my door. And by that point, the drama of my former relationship had completely escaped my mind. Now, for context, I live alone, and I don't get many visitors. I was more annoyed that I had been woken up than curious about who was at my door or why. And so you can imagine my shock when I flung the door open to find 2 police officers standing there, their faces stern. Shit, I thought. This is it. I'm gonna go to prison. Everyone's going to think that I'm some kind of freak. And in all fairness, I guess I was at the time. They asked me to come in, and of course I obliged, not wanting to make a scene and to potentially make things worse for myself. I remember thinking they've only asked to come in. As of right now, I'm not under arrest or anything, so I better see what they want. But what they asked me completely knocked the wind out of me. When was the last time that you saw Katie? And I was speechless. And for a second, I must have looked like the guiltiest, most suspicious person in the world. Realizing this, I quickly shook off the look of surprise and dread and answered as calmly as I could muster. Not since we broke up. Around 2 weeks ago. It was the truth. But it didn't save me from their barrage of questions and intense scrutiny. Where were you the night at home? I replied truthfully. Can anyone verify this? Well, no, I live alone. But one of my colleagues dropped me off at work. That's routine after every shift, so I guess he can. And what time was this? Around 10:30, I answered. The cameras at work should show me leaving around 10:20. It's about a 10-minute drive from there. Did you leave your property at any point after you returned? No, I said, trying to sound both firm and honest. There's a camera by the apartment entrance that will prove that I'm telling the truth. And the officer's intense stare seemed to waver slightly, so I decided to push my luck and ask, what's all this even about? And he paused and then said, although I can't share the details of an ongoing investigation, Katie has been reported missing. She hasn't been seen for close to a week. Her mother said that she was last seen leaving their home to go shopping, but she never returned. The officers left soon after, thanking me for my time. They verified my story with CCTV footage, my boss and my colleague, all of whom confirmed that I was telling the truth. And days turned into weeks, and still nothing. It seemed as though she had vanished into thin air. And I couldn't believe it. Could it have been because of me? I thought. Maybe some creep stalked her socials, found her address after I posted them, and... But surely it had to be a coincidence. That stupid forum couldn't be real. Santa's naughty list? I mean, come on, get a grip. But the longer that it went on, the worse that I felt. I knew I wasn't physically responsible, but in some way I had caused this. Or at least set it in motion. I felt just as guilty as if I had done something to her myself. This was the girl that I once loved. The girl that I still loved. And I had done this. I had caused this. God, her poor mother. They had been estranged for years, and I was the one who had got them to reconcile. And for what? So I could destroy her worse than she could have ever imagined? I couldn't live with what I had done. I tried to carry on with my life, but it was hard. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, and you know something? I knew I deserved it. Every time that I caught myself feeling sorry for myself, I cringed. I'm no victim. I'm a monster. A wolf in sheep's clothing. I deserved it. Not her. I was selfish and disgusting and pathetic. I was weak. So very weak. And so I turned to drinking, just to make myself sleep. Anything to numb the pain. Anything to drown out the image of her face and the sounds of her screams echoing in my mind. I couldn't go to the police. How could I? My life would be as good as over. And as selfish as it was, I didn't believe that it would even help to find her if I did. Maybe I was just a coward, but it felt hopeless. She was gone. And every morning I waited for updates, and every no new information today broke another piece of me. It was torture. Until one day, they found her. But as I'm sure that you can already tell, this story does not have a happy ending. Weeks passed, but she was eventually found in an old abandoned factory on the outskirts of the next town over. I couldn't believe it. My throat tightened to the point where I could barely breathe when I heard the news. Please, no. And in my head, I was begging and pleading with whoever or whatever could hear me that this had to be a mistake. A mix-up. This wasn't... It couldn't be because of me. But it wasn't a mix-up. There were no mistakes when you answer yes, I'm sure. I wanted her to suffer. And I guess I got my wish. She was found stuffed down one of the now defunct chimneys. Her body... It was inside of a sack. A toy sack. And I couldn't believe it. I felt sick. I feel sick thinking about it even now. This must be some kind of sick joke I tried and failed to convince myself. My body trembling uncontrollably. They left no article of clothing on her. Her body had been badly deteriorated by that point, but they knew it was her. They knew because stuffed in her eye socket was a small piece of paper. A small piece of paper that read, "Naughty list, Katie. You should have been good." And I blacked out. I collapsed right where I was standing and hit my head hard. And when I regained consciousness, I hoped and prayed it had all been a bad dream, but of course, it wasn't. It was real. It was all real. And it was all because of me. God, I am so sorry, Katie. I am so sorry. I'm sorry for what they did to you. I'm sorry for what I did to you. I have to live with my guilt every single day. And not a day goes by that I don't think about confessing. Or even ending my own life. And in some sick way, I think that might make up for it. Or at least make us even somehow. But I know that's impossible. I can't imagine what they did to you. What they put you through. I can't fathom the fear and terror that you must have felt. I can't bear to think of your final thoughts or how confused and alone you must have been. Nothing will make up for the torture I subjected the girl that I once loved to. All because of my own ego and pride and misguided sense of self-worth. And I wish that I could take it back. But I can't. And that will never change. You deserve justice, Katie. You deserve to rest in peace at the very least. And maybe confessing would bring you and your family closure. Maybe ending my own life would make us even. But regardless of the answer, I'm far too much of a coward for either.
It was suggested to me to post my story here from r/creepy encounters. This happened quite a few years ago. I had an affinity for a particular white substance in the form of lines back then. One very cold, snowy night around 11 p.m., I went for a walk to meet my dealer. I'd never been to his place before, so he gave me his address to his small 2-story apartment building with maybe 6 units in it. Upon arrival, I noticed several strangers inside. After they hit their pipes, 2 clearly unwashed guys came over to me to sit at the dining room table while I waited for my G. I've never smoked anything besides weed and cigarettes. I was instantly uncomfortable. They tried making this small talk, but I grew increasingly uneasy, giving me only short, vague answers. I quickly paid for my stuff, grabbed my baggie, and got it from the table. That's when one of the guys offered to walk me home. My heart started to sink. I politely declined. "Oh, I'm okay, thanks. I don't live far." The other guy stood up. "No, really, we can walk you. We don't mind. We have the gig going anyway." That's when my instincts finally kicked in. I became very aware and very scared. I immediately thought, I'm fully dressed and ready to go, but they still have to put on their coats and shoes. If I leave now, I'll get a head start and quickly disappear. They said something else as I headed out the door, but I pretended to take a phone call, waved goodbye to my dealer, and closed the door behind me. I jogged down the hallway and outside the door, and once I got outside, I ran for the street. I decided not to take a fast route home because, from the building, they'd be able to see me. I didn't want them knowing even the slightest direction I lived, if they were to really be trying to follow me. The building was at the end of the street, so instead of going straight up the hill, the way I initially came from, I turned right and started jogging. I kept glancing back and, finally, I saw them, about a block behind me, following me. The street I needed, Stanley Street, was across the intersection on my left, about another block ahead of this 4-way light. As I approached the intersection, I noticed the corner house on my right. There was an older man sitting on his porch, smoking. I recognized him. He was another dealer I had met only a few weeks ago before my usual guy was a little dry. I choked up as I got to his porch and asked him if he remembered me. He didn't ask, "What's wrong?" I quietly told him, "I think these 2 guys are following me," and asked if I could go inside for a minute until they passed. He didn't hesitate. We went inside, past his front living room and into the kitchen, where I explained what had happened. He told me not to worry, that I was safe there, and I could stay as long as I needed to. Then, we heard a knock at the door, and I started to panic. He went to the door, looked through the peephole, and yelled, "Just a minute!" He came back and quickly whispered that he knew the guys and was going to invite them in to have a hit. He told me to sneak through the back door, which was beyond the kitchen, go to the right of the yard, and find the gate. This would lead me to the side street. He instructed me to creep up along the side of his house, close to the shrubs, and check the porch to make sure they went inside. I followed his plan, and when the coast was clear, I didn't jog. I sprinted up Stanley Street and zigzagged all the way home. When I think back now, I'm in disbelief at my actions and how foolish I was. I thought I was invincible. I was far too trusting, but I truly thank God for that man who helped me that night. I don't know what those two guys wanted from me, but I'm forever grateful. I have never had to find out.
When my mum asked me to check on her friend Mr. Warren the week before Christmas, I couldn't say no. He was an older man who lived alone, the kind of neighbour who mostly kept to himself. My mum said he hadn't been answering her calls, and since I just finished my finals, she thought I had time. It was snowing when I walked up to his house, a lonely old building at the end of our street. Strings of Christmas lights dangled from the eaves, flickering faintly as if they'd given up trying. I rang the doorbell and waited. Nothing.
Mr. Warren?
I called, knocking loudly. My breath clouded the icy air as I waited. I thought I heard movement inside, barely audible, like something brushing against the floor. The door creaked open an inch, the gap spilling dim light onto the porch. I hesitated.
Hello?
The hallway beyond was dimly lit by a small Christmas tree in the corner of the living room. It was decorated with only a few ornaments and lights that blinked erratically, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I stepped inside, immediately struck by the cold. It was freezing, colder than it should have been for a house with the heater on. The air had a faint metallic tang that made my stomach tighten.
Mr. Warren, it's James from next door. My mom wanted me to check on you.
The silence was oppressive. Something about the way the shadows danced made me feel unwelcome, like I'd stepped into someone else's space uninvited. I moved toward the kitchen, where I thought I'd heard the noise. The linoleum floor was slick, and as I reached the doorway, I froze. There was a trail of something smeared across the floor, dark red streaks that led toward the basement door. I backed up a step, my chest tightening. My first instinct was to leave, but I thought about Mr. Warren. What if he was hurt?
Mr. Warren?
My voice cracked. No response. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam illuminating the blood-stained floor, and I forced myself to follow the trail to the basement door. It was slightly ajar, the dark void beyond swallowing the light. I nudged the door open with my foot. It groaned on its hinges, revealing the staircase that descended into blackness.
Hello?
I called again, gripping my phone like it was some kind of shield. I heard a noise from below, a faint scuffling sound. My pulse hammered in my ears.
Are you okay? Do you need help?
The noise stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. Then I heard it. A low, rasping voice, barely more than a whisper.
Come down.
My blood ran cold. The voice didn't sound like Mr. Warren. It sounded wrong, hoarse and strained, like whoever was speaking hadn't used their voice in years. I took a shaky step back, my legs weak beneath me. As I did, the Christmas tree lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into near darkness. I bolted for the front door. I'd barely made it to the threshold when I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs behind me. Not rushed or panicked, steady, purposeful. I didn't look back. Outside, the snow fell in thick sheets, muffling every sound. I sprinted to my car and locked the doors, fumbling with the keys to start the engine. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the ignition. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the house. For a moment, thought I saw something in the front window. A tall figure standing just beyond the glass, watching me. I didn't wait to see more. I threw the car into reverse and sped down the street, not stopping until I was safely home. When the police arrived, they found Mr. Warren in the basement. He was slumped in an old chair, his body limp, his throat cut. The blood on the floor matched the pattern I'd seen. The officers searched the house but found no one else. They said the back door was unlocked and suggested whoever had been there must have fled, but they didn't hear the voice. They didn't see the figure watching from the window. I haven't told my mum the full story. She thinks Mr. Warren was the victim of a break-in, a tragic but random crime. I let her believe that, but every time I drive past his house, I can't help but glance at the window. And sometimes, just for a second, I swear I still see the faint outline of someone still standing there, waiting.
Christmas was definitely different back then. Maybe it's just the haze of nostalgia painting everything gold and red like ornaments, but I swear to you, they were magical back then. I grew up inside this tiny town that you couldn't even find on a map, nestled between a pair of nameless hills where everybody knew everybody, and secrets traveled faster than the snowstorms. We had our share of holiday traditions, sure, but none of them really mattered more than the ones that I made with Ruth, Benny, and Jacob. We weren't just friends, we were a gang. A pack of kids with runny noses and red cheeks, owning the neighborhoods like it was our own kingdom. That winter break was sacred. The second bell rang on the last day of school. We'd grab our sleds and bundle up like astronauts and immediately hit the snow. Snowmen, snowball fights, ice forts, you name it, we did it all. But nothing was better than sledding. There was a stretch of untouched land behind the old neighborhood. A secret hill that we all swore that we were the only ones that knew about. It was our Mount Everest. And the best part about it all was there was no adults. Nobody to tell you that you're going too fast or to even watch out for that tree. It was just us and that hill. That's what was Christmas to me. The sting of the cold air, the crunch of the snow, and my friends laughing so hard that they could barely breathe. My story takes place just like every other Christmas, with presents in the morning and then sledding in the afternoon. My mom had made her famous cinnamon rolls, the smell filling up the whole house. My dad had the game on in the background, the announcer's voice booming over the sound of wrapping paper. By noon, I'd finished up my holiday duties. I thanked my grandparents for the socks that I'd never wear. I helped my sister set up her new dollhouse and dodged enough hugs to last me for a lifetime. That's when I got a call. It was Benny, the self-appointed leader of our little group. "You ready?" he asked, his voice crackling through the old rotary phone in the kitchen. "Yeah, where are we meeting at?" "The school. Bring your sled. It's perfect out here, fresh snow and nobody around." I could hear the excitement in his voice, and it immediately lit up a fire in me. 10 minutes later, I was trudging through the snow with my sled, cold biting at my face. By the time I reached the schoolyard, Ruth and Jacob were already there, bundled up and grinning like maniacs. Benny wasn't kidding, the snow was pristine. "You guys ready for the big hill?" Benny asked, eyes gleaming. Ruth groaned and adjusted her scarf. "That thing's a death trap." "Which makes it awesome," Jacob said, clapping her on the back. "Come on, Ruthie, don't be a chicken." "I'm not a chicken," she snapped. "All right then, let's go," Benny said, already leading the way. The walk to the hill itself was really half the adventure, winding through backyards and weaving between the trees. We passed the houses with twinkling lights and windows fogged with the warmth. But it felt like we were the only people in the world right now, just us in the snow. All I felt was excitement as we reached the hill a little before 2. The sun was now hanging low in the sky. It was perfect, untouched, and silent except for the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. We wasted no time. We raced up to the top and threw ourselves down that slope. almost like we were invincible. And for a while, we really were. It didn't take long for the hill to come alive with the sounds of our laughter and screams. Benny was the first to build a ramp, a crude pile of snow that barely held its shape, but it launched him into the air for almost half a second, and that was really the only inspiration we needed. Soon, we had an entire obstacle course carved into those slopes. Ramps, even trenches. Benny said it was quote-unquote professional grade, and Jacob nodded like he was some kind of sledding architect. We stayed out there for hours, pushing our limits with every run. The snow turned to ice in patches. The sun was slipping lower and painting the sky in a fiery orange. My legs ached from climbing up and down that hill over and over. My gloves were soaked through, but I didn't care. None of us did. It was a perfect day. It started as a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was some kind of animal, a deer maybe, or even a stray dog, but when I looked closer, I realized it was a person, a man to be exact, standing half hidden among the trees. "Hey!" I called out to my friends, pointing towards the woods. "Any you guys see that?" Benny squinted, shielding his eyes with one hand. What?" "There," I said. "Somebody's watching us." Ruth and Jacob turned to look, their faces scrunched in confusion. "Probably just another kid, who cares?" Jacob said. But I didn't think it was another kid. There was something about the way he just stood there, so still it was unnatural. I kept watching as he stepped into the clearing, and that's when I saw him properly for the first time. Troy. Every kid in town knew Troy Delaney. He was much older than us, maybe 16 or 17. He had a reputation. Fights, theft, vandalism, you name it. Troy had probably done it. He was the guy that you crossed the street to avoid, and now he was here, trudging through the snow with his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. "Oh, great," Ruth muttered. "What's he doing here?" "I don't know," Benny said, his voice low. "Let's just ignore him." That was easier said than done. Troy reached the bottom of the hill and plopped down on a mound of snow, watching us with a smirk that made my stomach twist. He didn't say a word, didn't even move, just sat there like he owned the place. Jacob was the first to break the tension. "Whatever," he said, grabbing his sled. "I'm not gonna let you ruin this." He and Ruth went for another run, racing side by side down the hill. I watched them go, my eyes darting back to Troy every few seconds. He didn't really seem to care about the sledding. He just kept staring, almost like he was sizing us all up. When Jacob and Ruth reached the bottom, Troy then sprang to his feet. He moved really fast, cutting across the snow almost in a blur. By the time I realized what was happening, it was far too late. "Hey!" Jacob yelled, his voice cracking as Troy grabbed him by the collar. Ruth tried to run away, but Troy was quicker. He shoved Jacob into the snow, yanking at his scarf until it came loose. Then his attention turned to Ruth. She quickly swung her sled at him, but he dodged it easily, laughing as he grabbed a handful of snow and shoved it into her face. "Leave him alone!" Benny shouted, already halfway down the hill. I was right behind him, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time we reached the bottom of the hill, Troy had backed off, standing a few feet away with that same smug grin plastered on his face. Jacob was clutching his nose, blood dripping onto the snow, while Ruth wiped her eyes. Her face was red and tear-streaked. "What is your problem, man?" Benny demanded, stepping in front of us like some kind of shield. Troy shrugged, kicking at the snow. "I'm just having fun." "Yeah, well, find somebody else to mess with," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowed at me. "Or what?" I didn't have an answer for him. None of us did. We just stood there glaring until he finally turned and walked back to his spot on the mound. "Let's just go," Ruth said. "I don't want to be here anymore." We all nodded, gathered our sleds, and started back towards the trail. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting Troy to follow us, but he just sat there, watching. We were barely halfway down the trail when I heard the crunch of footsteps behind us. I turned around and saw Troy, a dark silhouette against the snow following at a distance. He didn't say anything, didn't shout or make any of his usual threats. He just followed, close enough to make his presence known, but far enough to keep us guessing. "Why is he doing this?" Ruth whispered. "Because he's a psycho," Benny said. "Just ignore him." But how do you ignore somebody like that? Someone who knows exactly how to get under your skin, who knows exactly how to make you feel completely helpless. We all walked faster, picking up the pace as our boots crunched in unison. But Troy kept pace. Every so often he'd whistle, a high sharp sound that cut out through the cold. It felt like a game to him, like he was waiting for one of us to snap. I wanted to call out, to say something, to shout, run back and shove him into the snow, but I couldn't do it. My throat was tight and my chest was heavy. I just kept imagining him lunging at us, grabbing Ruth or Jacob, and there'd be really nothing we could do to stop him. As we continued walking, the trail narrowed as it wound through the neighborhood. All these houses were smaller and older, their Christmas lights flickering dimly against the growing dark. Benny was leading, his shoulders squared and his fists clenched around the rope of his sled. Jacob limped beside him, holding a wad of snow against his bloody nose. Ruth was just ahead of me. Her head was still down. Troy continued to stay behind us, close enough that I could still hear his boots crunching against the snow. He wasn't whistling anymore. Instead, he was muttering to himself, just loud enough for the words to reach us. They were low and disjointed, fragments of threats and curses. I couldn't quite make them all out though. "Think you're so tough, don't you?" I heard him say. "Little punks, I could bury you out here and nobody would find you till spring." Ruth stiffened at that, glancing back over her shoulder. Her eyes were now wide and her breath was visible in the cold. "What are we gonna do?" she whispered, her voice barely even audible. Benny didn't answer her. He just kept walking. His pace was quickening though as we approached a side street. I knew where he was heading, Benny's house. More importantly, Benny's older brother Raph. Raph was a senior in high school, built like a linebacker and meaner than a junkyard dog. If anybody could deal with Troy, it was definitely him. The side street was empty. The snow was untouched, except for a single set of tire tracks. The shadows of the houses stretched out long and dark across the road. I felt exposed for some reason, almost like we were walking through a trap, but Benny didn't even hesitate. He turned down the street, his sled bouncing behind him. Troy stopped at the corner, watching from a distance. I could still see his silhouette against the pale glow of the streetlights. For a moment, I thought he was going to continue to follow us, but he laughed, this low guttural sound that made my stomach turn. "Chickens," he called out, voice echoing down the street. "Running home to mommy and daddy. Pathetic." Benny spun around, his face red with anger. "Keep talking, Troy. See what happens when Raph gets a hold of you." Troy smirked, shaking his head. "You think I'm scared of Raph? You don't know anything, kid." He turned around and walked back the way he came from, his hands still stuffed in his pockets. The tension in my chest loosened, but it didn't go away completely. When we finally reached Benny's house a few minutes later, the warm glow of the windows was a welcome sight. Raph was actually sitting on the porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked up as we approached, his brow furrowing when he saw Jacob's bloody nose. "What the hell happened?" he asked, standing up and flicking the cigarette into the snow. "Troy Delaney happened," Benny said. His voice was shaking with anger. "He jumped Jacob and Ruth and then followed us all the way here." Raph's expression darkened, his jaw tightened. "He did, huh?" Before any of us could stop him, Raph was off the porch and marching down the street. Benny called after him, but he didn't stop. His broad shoulders disappeared off into the shadows. We stayed on the porch huddled together in silence, cold continuing to seep through our layers. I kept staring down that street, expecting to see Troy, that grin plastered across his face still, but I didn't see him. The rest of the night was kind of a blur. Benny's mom patched up Jacob's nose while Ruth called her parents to come pick her up. I stayed for a while and sat in the living room with Benny as the Christmas tree lights just blinked on and off. Neither of us really saying much. The next day, the news spread pretty fast. Troy had been arrested late that night. He got caught breaking into another kid's house. They said he'd beaten the kid so badly that he needed stitches, but the part that stuck with me was how they found him. He wasn't laughing or smirking like he was with us. He was crying. His face was pale and his hands were shaking as they cuffed him. I didn't see Troy again after that. His family ended up moving a few months later. And our famous hill, it fell out of our rotation. It just never felt the same after that day. I always tell people that bartending isn't as glamorous as they think. Sure, you've got your free drinks and your regulars who tip big if you keep their glasses full, but it's a grind. Long hours of drunk people spilling their life stories all over you. Constant hum of music and chatter that almost drills into your skull. When I was younger, it was a pretty decent gig. It paid the bills and kept my fridge stocked. Gave me enough extra to feel like I wasn't just scraping by. But to me, it was never really more than that. It was just a job. The worst part though, at least in my opinion, was the holidays. We didn't get to skip out on Christmas, New Year's, or even the other days that most people spent with their families. The bar still opened, and somebody had to be there to sling drinks for those who didn't have anywhere else to go, or didn't want to. We tried to spread the misery around, divvying up the shifts so nobody got stuck with all those crappy days, but it was still a roll of the dice. And that year, you guessed it, my number came up for Christmas. "Just think about the tips," my boss said with a grin, handing me the schedule. I gave a fake smile back, but my jaw was clenched so hard, I thought my teeth might crack. The truth was, the tips didn't make up for it. Christmas at the bar was this weird mix of festive and depressing. We decorated the place with tinsel and those cheap string lights that blinked like they were on their last leg. The TVs playing old Christmas movies with the volume low, while a mix of holiday classics and rock ballads blared out from the jukebox. We even had a few peppermint-themed drink specials that nobody ever wanted. The crowd that came in was always pretty predictable, mostly regulars, the same old guys who occupied the same stools every week, nursing their beers and swapping stories about when life was better. But Christmas would always bring a few wild cards. The lonely ones, looking for somewhere to go or somebody to talk to. They'd wander in with red noses and wide eyes, clinging to their coats like they'd been outside just long enough to lose all their warmth. I tried to not think about what it all meant, being here instead of, well, anywhere else. Just keep my head down, pour a few drinks, and watch the clock crawl towards closing time. When I noticed the guy at the far end of the bar, he was half hidden in the shadows, and I don't remember seeing him come in, but there he was, staring at me like he was waiting for me to do something. "Doing okay over there?" I called out, forcing a smile. He didn't answer me, just tilted his head slightly. The night dragged on, the usual lull that followed the initial holiday rush. People were drinking slowly now, most of them looking at their watches, ready to leave to go wherever the night was going to take them. But that man didn't move. He continuously watched me from the end of the bar, and it was starting to get under my skin. His eyes almost seemed to never leave me, dark and unreadable. I kept busy, wiping the counter down, pouring drinks, and trying my best not to glance over at him. But it was like he was pulling my attention and forcing it back to him. I tried to brush it off, but the longer I worked, the more uncomfortable I started to feel. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. "Can I get you anything else?" I asked, setting the glass down that I'd been cleaning. His voice was low and there was an edge to it. "You got any of that special drink you were talking about earlier, the peppermint one?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "We got a few, they're on the specials menu." He gave a single nod and still didn't break eye contact. I turned away to fix it. The feeling of his gaze stayed with me though, gnawing at the back of my neck. I handed him the drink, but he didn't move to take it. Instead, he just sat there, staring. "You're not gonna tell me what's really going on, are you?" he said. I paused, my hand still hovering near his glass. I blinked and was completely unsure of how to respond to him. "Excuse me?" "I know something about you," he said, leaning forward just slightly. "You don't belong here. Not tonight." I forced out a laugh. It's just a job. I'm here like everybody else." He didn't laugh with me. His head tilted again. The rest of the night seemed to pass in a blur. The bar cleared out and just a few of the regulars were left, nursing their drinks. Occasionally I would steal glances at the man, but he never took his eyes off me. Every time I turned, I felt his gaze follow. He had not moved from that spot, but I had this distinct feeling that he really wasn't sitting anymore. He was waiting. By the time I finished cleaning up, the place was almost empty, save for a few people who were still finishing their drinks. I locked up and hit the lights and grabbed my coat. That cold hit me immediately as I stepped outside. My car was parked near the back of the lot, half buried underneath fresh snow. I had planned to call for a tow truck, but I thought better of it. It's Christmas Eve. I didn't want to bother anybody on a night like this, so I just figured I'd walk home. My walk really isn't that long. It's only about 1.5 miles, but in the freezing cold with the snow biting at my skin, it would feel like an eternity. The streetlights flickered in the distance. The world felt quiet. As I reached that first intersection, I checked both ways. No cars, no movement. The street was still, just like the rest of the city. I took a quick breath and stepped onto the crosswalk. And that's when I heard footsteps. At first, they seemed distant, almost like I wasn't sure what I was hearing, especially with the wind howling and the snow crunching beneath me. When I turned, I saw him. There he was again, the man from the bar. I froze. He was walking in my exact footsteps, keeping pace. His head was down and his breath was rising up in clouds. I quickened my pace, the heels of my boots clicking against the pavement faster now, but when I looked back, he had closed the distance. I glanced around. No cars, no businesses. The street was empty. It was just me and him. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice shaky. "The hell do you want from me?" He didn't answer me. My pulse pounded in my ears as I walked faster. He was still behind me, matching every step. I was almost home now though, just a few more blocks. But then I heard him shout, "You don't belong here," he yelled, his voice harsh and twisted. "You never did." I was close enough now that I could see my house at the end of the block. His footsteps were still behind me, closing in, and I could swear that I heard his breath now, heavy and shallow. Before I could make a move, I felt his hand on my shoulder. My scream was in my throat, but it caught in my chest as I was shoved hard against the cold brick of a building. His breath was hot against my ear, his body pressing in close around me. "Please," I gasped, struggling to free myself. "Get off me, what do you want?" I got no response, only his grip tightened, and for a moment I thought this was it. I would be left out here in the dark, no one to help and no one to stop him. And that's when I heard another shout. I looked up, trying to focus through my panic. Across the street, I saw 3 men walking toward me, their eyes wide with alarm. They were carrying something, cases, musical equipment maybe. They set them down in the snow and quickly rushed toward us. "Get off her!" one of the men yelled. his voice deep and pretty commanding. The man who'd been holding me stepped back and muttered something under his breath. He turned and quickly ran down an alley before the trio of men could even reach me. Those men stayed with me as I shakily called the police. They were kind, offered reassurance while they kept their eyes on the alley. It felt like forever before the police finally showed up, and when they did, they couldn't really find any trace of the man. I still didn't feel safe, even with them there. Those men insisted on escorting me home, making sure that I got inside without any more incident. When I finally closed that door behind me, I breathed a sigh of relief, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. The man had seen something in me, and something that I couldn't quite explain. But thankfully, I never saw him again.